All right, me. It is mid to late September, not September, February. Lord have mercy, I am a number of months off. Um, it's the 20th to be precise, and during the last 2 days of substitute teaching, I finished reading Matt Parker's Humble Pie. This is a signed version. This is actually one of my Christmas presents that I was given this past Christmas. Mostly because I always struggle to come up with gifts for myself because I hate getting gifts. I don't even like thinking about it. And this was just say, well, I know my Matt Parker has other books. I don't want to ship them myself from England, so there's a gift. But yeah. It's subtitled as a comedy of math errors, which in a lot of ways it is, right? It is in a lot of ways looking at math and poking fun at the real world situations in which math occurs, in which something that is so simple can have these wide-ranging effects on things, and even things that aren't simple, but one small thing becomes this monstrosity, right? And for that reason, because it is written as a set of stories that are all talking about different things that kind of build on one another, this is way more approachable and I guess the term I would be looking for would be easier to understand than things to make and do the fourth dimension. I still enjoyed reading both of them, but this was certainly much more approachable and felt much more comfortable being and understanding what Matt Parker was talking about and explaining throughout these things, right? But the reason for that is because what Matt Parker is talking about in all of these things are things that have become publicly available records, mostly due to massive disasters that have occurred because of them, right? Whether that is huge losses of human life, massive destruction of bridges or of other buildings, massive financial disasters, right? And then some are just this is a weird thing that happened with a government-owned thing, and it is the government's responsibility to then give a reason as to why this occurred, right? Which is where almost all the examples come from, right? Because it is one of these very weird things about mathematics, of where, people tend to think of mathematics as this, especially at the high school level, and even college and recent college graduates of mathematics, is this kind of like ethereal item of where you either get it or you don't. And then, question the studying of pure mathematics and how do we actually use math and use all these higher level math skills and whatnot, right? And the reality of the situation is that, we can explain jobs and we can explain, how this kind of gets used, but so much of math, because it is proprietary, can't be discussed, right? And a whole bunch of these things about how math actually gets used on a day-to-day basis, you can't actually discuss because people sign NDAs, people sign things to work for this company and work for these engineers, because, right, these businesses have this concept or idea that because they're paying and funding for the research, they need to then also own that research, right? And this gets talked about by Matt Parker at the very end of where we go now with this, now that we've all just discussed all of these different things. And it is this whole thing of where, like, he would love to be able to talk about where engineering is now, but so many of his friends that are involved in things and have admitted mistakes in things that are not life-threatening. They just changed aesthetics, or they are involved in banking, and they are, there's mess ups here, there's mess ups there, but they can't disclose any of that because it's not, doing so would be possibly losing their jobs, right? And it's just this fascinating thing of, right, the only time that we get to know about things is because of disasters, right? So that's that. A great deal of what Matt Parker discussed was also things that I was at least vaguely aware of or knew a great deal about, because of not only my personal watching of math stuff and whatnot, but also because so much of it is based in disaster stuff. There is so much of it is engineering disasters, I listened to a podcast for a very long time that was about plane disasters and what actually caused them to occur, and what the FAA discovered through these, and things like that. And so a whole bunch of this I was already very familiar with, but it didn't make it any less enjoyable to read. Yeah. A great deal, I would say, of this book talks about, well, the Swiss cheese model of disasters and failure, which is one of these really fascinating concepts of, like, right, that because things are built and because things have margins of errors, right, everything has some sort of probability for failure, right? And what the goal is to create effectively this Swiss cheese model, right, of where, if you think about Swiss cheese as having holes within it, then, right, some things will go through those holes, but then get blocked by the next slice of cheese that doesn't have a hole in that spot, right? It is only when all of these holes line up exactly that then the disaster occurs, right? And a great deal of it, of this book, I would say, is discussing about these things. I don't remember exactly when it gets brought in, but like, it was really a discussion that happened quite a bit, right, about like this, when actually talking about disasters of, how does this actually occur, right? So yeah. Which is, one of these fascinating things, because then it also goes back into engineering of, like, okay, when we are trying to put layers up for preventing disasters from happening, right, are we actually creating barriers, or are we just putting things up to say that we put things up, right? And so, for instance, the big one that I can think about is I think it was a British Airlines flight that was flying to Spain, and the cockpit, the windshield of the cockpit suddenly burst open, flew off the plane, and one of the pilots was partially sucked out, and no one died. That plane went back into service, but it was one of these massive things of, how does something like this happen? And it's, well, the maintenance of these airplanes was understaffed. Therefore, the maintenance manager had to do some of these maintaining things. Maintenance manager was the store parts that were supposed to be held in the hangar were not there. There was not enough of them to replace this windshield, and so he has to go to a second unmanned store parts that is not properly lit, and he gets what he thinks are the correct bolts, brings it back, puts it together. But he has to put it together in kind of this weird way of it's really a two-man job, but he's the only one there, so and that he doesn't have quite the proper tools because the place that he is doing the repairs isn't properly outfitted. But he has to fix the airplane. He has to fix this windshield, and so he has to do this kind of weird thing in which he is tightening bolts, but he's having to use a driver instead of a hand torque, which would properly measure every single time. But he also has to be holding the windshield in place, which means that he can't feel that the torque isn't quite right and where it's supposed to be. He's just trusting the drill. And then, it's thing after thing after thing. And then the final thing really, it really becomes, well, number one, the rules in place don't say that the cockpit windshield has to be or is a mandatory flight requirement, and therefore it doesn't need to be double checked by everyone. And right, because it is the maintenance manager on duty that is doing the repairs, no one has to check his work, right? And as it turns out, this airplane had two different bolts that were like millimeters apart in terms of length and millimeters apart in terms of width. And so he accidentally ends up grabbing something that's the right width, but or it's the right length, but not quite the right width. And as it turns out, at the very end of all of this, it turns out that the parts that had already been installed on the windshield in the first place, the ones that he had been replacing, were also already the wrong bolts. They had been improperly put in the first place, and so he had no chance whatsoever on putting the right things in, right? And as it turns out, it was like 40% of all bolts were the incorrect bolts or whatever. I don't remember the exact number. In almost all windshields. And it's this huge, massive thing of, not only is there this Swiss cheese problem of everything has gone wrong for this to occur, and that when it does occur, it turns out that there's even more layers to this than anyone could ever imagined, because now it is a whole issue of, not only has all of this been done improperly, but the entire setup is incorrect, and the entire assumptions that we are making are incorrect. And it's just one of those fascinating things, not only from an aviation standpoint, but also just from a math standpoint and an engineering standpoint of how willing are we to push the limits here, right? It is also, I think Matt Parker does a great job about this, a lot of issues that involve humans, which is that humans, he recognized that humans are very natural estimators, right? We have an understanding immediately of the gut feeling of if something is going to work in terms of engineering, right? We can take a look at it and go, that's probably not going to work, or that probably will work, right? And as we have become so industrialized and so fine in terms of measurements, right? Because we have pushed the boundaries of what we can manufacture and we can build to the very extreme limit, right? Our understanding is no longer the same, right? And so a lot of things that would have been caught through innate understanding and us looking at something and going, that probably doesn't work, no longer happens, because we are judging things by millimeters, right? And we just don't have the same innate understanding anymore, which is both fantastic because it means that we are progressing so much, but it's also terrifying because now we are relying a lot on things that we don't quite understand, right? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Any other really fun things to talk about? Talk a lot about randomization, right? Because randomization in mathematics is effectively impossible, because in order to get random, you first have to input things, right? And so to get fully random is not truly able unless you figure out something that to feed something through that would be random in the first place, right? Which is fascinating. Lots of stuff on concepts of the improper use of numbers, right? Especially within Microsoft Excel, because Excel spreadsheets are not a database, right? They are a spreadsheet, and so they're made for calculating large numbers, but they're not meant for storing numbers. And so, you end up with this thing of a whole bunch of errors occurring, especially in a financial district and within companies, because they're not using the proper tools that are available to them, and instead using the easiest to access tool, and it causing massive issues, right? Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's I mean, this is a really fun book. It just is. It is this very fun exploration through a lot of math ideas and concepts, whether that be through engineering, through finances, and whatnot. And it's just enjoyable, right? If I had to teach math and I had to have a requirement for reading, because that is what some states are still going to, is having some sort of reading requirement within math, it would be within probably a Matt Parker book, that we would go, okay, what do we get out of this kind of deal, right? So that's that. I think that's it for Humble Pie by Matt Parker. Fantastic read, very fun. Yeah.